I was 9 years old when my nan passed away. Guess you can call it passing away, although the end wasn't something I would associate with the gentle word passing with. Up until she came to stay with us, she was my best friend. She was quirky, loving, fun, insanely good cook. My mum would drop me off at her house and she would sit us in front of her ancient television. You know, the ones with the gigantic antenna, with a housing with big knobs on the side, all outfitted in some weird wood vinyl. And I loved it, even if the picture wasn't as clear as the one back home. My favorite movies when I was a kid were Disney movies. I think I watched Little Mermaid 12 times and destroyed the tape because of it. When I wasn't entranced by the magic of Disney, she was chasing me around the cluttered two-room house. She used to do this thing where she would flap her upper dentures in her mouth and chase me down the hall, with me screaming out of excitement and maybe a tinge of fear. She'd wrap up my stay at her house by cooking us hearty, crawly dishes, like red beans and rice with moist cornbread, and perfect for dipping in the thick bean paste. I started going to her house less and less over the years. My mother and father were going through a messy divorce. That's a whole different story, though. We moved across the Pontchartrain Lake, approximately 45 minutes from her home. My nan started becoming more forgetful too. She'd forget to cook lunch, forget where her keys were. The last time I went to her house, my nan stood staring in a reflective aluminum decorative plate in the hallway. Tears were pouring down her tan and weathered face. Her wrinkled mouth was poking out in an almost childish pucker, trembling ever so slightly. I went up to her, my hand in hers, looking up with her. "What is it, Nan?" "I saw her up there. She won't leave me alone. She keeps laughing at me." I stared bug-eyed up into the plate with her, the hairs on the nape of my neck rising. All I saw was a distorted reflection of Nan staring at herself. My mother told us she was getting old and it was irresponsible to leave us alone with her now. We saw her even less. I remember sitting in our spare room playing the Sega Mega Drive when my mom came to tell me about Nan. She was unable to live on her own, her mind rapidly deteriorating. My mom, aunt and uncle couldn't stand to put her in a home. The guilt would kill them. They agreed to rotate her stays between the three of them. She came to stay with us first. The woman my mum brought home that day looked like a shell of my nan. She was so worn and washed, slumping her back and shuffling her feet slowly. Her eyes were distant, but she still tugged the corners of her mouth into the ghost of my nan's smile when she saw me. I hugged her, tenderly, afraid that she would snap. My mother helped her into the spare room to get settled and left to fetch more bags while I helped her set up her things. My back was turned to her while I busied putting her necessities on the nightstand. I kept my eyes focused on the task, musing over a can of spray-on deodorant, not really sure how it worked. I pulled a bulky cosmetic mirror out of her bag. It was rather large, with lights on either side that would work if you plugged it into the wall. I transported the awkward weight of it onto the stand, the last few inches slipping from my hands and hitting the wood with a bang. I snapped my hands away from the mirror into my sides with a sharp intake of breath. My grandmother was standing just far enough behind me that her upper half appeared in the reflection beside me. Her face was twisted in such an ugly expression of hatred. She was looking past me into her own disgust-filled eyes. Nan? My little voice wavered uncertainly in the tense silence. She wouldn't falter from her standoff with her own reflection. I was afraid to turn around, as if somehow being confronted with the real face of undisguised hatred would have much more terrifying effects than her reflections. I did the only logical thing a child would do. I bolted from the room without even laying eyes on her. I ran straight to my room and locked the door. When I went into her room that night to give her a kiss goodnight, as per my mother's request, the mirror was face down on the nightstand. I lay in my bed that night, knees tucked up to my chest, falling into an uneasy sleep to the sound of my grandmother weeping as my mother bathed her. I didn't spend much one-on-one time with her after that. It only progressed from there. They would switch her off every 2 weeks. I always started acting bitter and moody whenever our time came up. I didn't mean to. And I didn't know that I wouldn't have much more time with the woman I loved, but was slowly becoming afraid of. My young brain couldn't wrap around the concept that she wasn't going to get better and live a long, long time. I still feel kind of guilty about my feelings towards her this last 3 months. It was early November, and the first inkling of winter making itself known in South Louisiana. It always took forever to get under 75 degrees, and it never stayed long. My mother bathed my grandmother early that night, and sat her in front of a vanity and brushed her dark red hair. I'll say this, she never went fully grey, having her beautiful full head of hair until the end. My grandmother suddenly started sprouting profanities at the mirror, out of nowhere, spittle flying from her mouth. My mother's hand froze over my grandma's head mid-brush. "Fucking bitch! Leave me alone!" My grandmother's hands were clutching the fabric of her nightgown, knuckles turning white. My mother and I wore similar expressions of shock, but my mother composed herself first. Putting the brush down, she furrowed her brows and stared at my grandmother's trembling reflection in the vanity mirror. My grandma was staring at her reflection with hatred, but this time it had an undercurrent of fear.
Mom, what is going on? Did I hurt you?
My mother asked, approaching the question as if she were a hysterical child. Her expression scared me. I couldn't look away. I couldn't do anything. My grandma lifted her head, pointing a shaking, wrinkled finger at herself in the mirror. Her reflection followed her, pointing the same finger back at her. "She's going to kill me! Can't you see her? She's laughing!" And that's the rest of the conversation my mother let me hear. And I was okay with that. She ushered me out of the room while telling my grandmother it was time for her medicine. I glanced back, her finger still pointing at her reflection. I could only see the back of my grandmother's head, but her posture was tense. I assumed she was still disdaining at her reflection. Her reflection, however, was grinning impossibly, showing all her bottom teeth and the absence of her top teeth. When I came home from school the next day, I heard sounds of a struggle and my mother's yells emanating from my grandmother's room. I remember slowly approaching the corner, my heart in my throat. I peeked around the corner of the hallway to where the guest bedroom was. The door was ajar. The only light coming from the room was from the window, blinds drawn shut. I yelped when my grandmother leapt into view and struck the full-length mirror in the corner of the room next to the window. I could see her reflection illuminated by light of the window, yet my grandmother's frame was dark. Her reflection had wild eyes, hair jutting out of her head. Her mouth formed an O, a silent scream as she repeatedly banged her fist against the mirror. Her attempts were successful, creating cracks in the mirror. With fist pounding, spiderwebs of cracks appeared on impact. Whether it was from a trick of the dim lighting or my overactive, frightened, childish imagination, thin cracks laced her reflection's face, still frozen in a scream. My mother pulled her away from the mirror and into bed, frantically talking to someone on the phone, perched between her shoulder and cheek. My mother prepared to drive my grandmother somewhere, presumably to the doctor's for an emergency dose of medication. My mother buckled her shaking form into the back seat, while she whimpered frantically under her breath. My own lip trembled at what my nan had turned into. My mum managed a stressed smile, gently tracing her finger on my cheek.
"We'll be right back. Mr. Johnson next door is there if you need him. There's cookies on the counter too. But can you do Mommy one favor?"
I nodded silently.
"Can you grab all the bed sheets out of the linen closet and cover the mirrors in your nan's room?"
I nodded again, still silent. She watched me go inside and ensured I locked the door before driving off, leaving me with my task. The atmosphere in my grandma's room was grim and stale. I immediately flipped on all possible lights in the room, despite it being daylight outside. I paused only a moment to stare at my reflection, who wore the same expression of uneasiness. I turned my head to the right and to the left, never tearing my eyes from my own reflection. He followed my movements. I threw the dark blue king-size sheet over the full-length mirror, another one over the vanity mirror, and tucked the cosmetic mirror into one of my grandmother's bags. The ceiling light flickered, and an uneasy feeling pressed against the back of my neck. Your body has ways of warning you when something isn't right. An alarm went off in my mind. It didn't take long to run out of the room and shut the door behind me, not bothering to turn off the light. I shook it off and prepared myself for an afternoon of spoiling my dinner with cookies and Nickelodeon. My mother came home that night with a tear-rimmed red eyes. She sat next to me and explained my grandmother needed to be admitted to the hospital for attempting to hurt herself. My mother later confessed to me as I got older that, as they were waiting in the exam room at the doctor's, my grandmother lunged her body at the small mirror above the sink head first. Her forehead shattered the glass, and before my mum had time to cross the room, she'd picked up a shard and tried to cut the corner of her mouth into her cheek. My mother told me she laughed while saying in a childlike voice, "I'll give you something to smile about, you fucking bitch." My grandmother never came back to the house after that. She stayed in a home for people who'd gone too far to be cared for by their families. The times I visited her, she was strapped into her bed. She was never fully conscious. She was a skeleton. In her bed was her fucking casket. She always cried. There were no mirrors in the room, nor any reflective surfaces at all. The last time I saw her, my mother checked me out of school abruptly, telling me it's very important I come see her. "She's not going so well," she explained. I walked gingerly up to her bed, her breathing filling the silence between beeps from the machine at her side. She had a tube in her nose to pump oxygen into her failing body. Her breathing was so ragged, drawn out as if something awfully heavy sat on her chest. Her skin was stark yellow, so cold. I slipped my hand into her thin, bony hand one last time. I noticed the restraints around her wrist were gone. Her eyes fluttered open at the sensation of my touch, her breathing becoming more rapid. Her head slowly rolled towards me, eyelids struggling against their own weight. She laid eyes on me, and her eyebrows drew together in an expression of sadness. A low, drawn-out whine escaped her lips. Quietly, barely audible to anyone but me, as my mum was at the doorway sadly speaking to the doctor, she said her last words to me in a low-pitched wheeze. "Not you." With that exertion, her eyelids fluttered over her tired eyes, and her ragged breathing continued. I sadly slipped my hand from hers, whispered a final "I love you," and walked out. I sat outside the door in a chair while my mother said goodbye. She died that night, jaundiced and fighting for breath, slowly suffocating. My mother told me she had Alzheimer's. I hear it's hereditary, and I'm constantly trying to keep my mind engaged. The doctors didn't know why her body gave up at the end, but I think she was just tired of fighting with herself. She was only 74. I'm 26 now. I'm still haunted by that experience. I always look at myself in the mirror and wonder who that reflection might turn into. I don't really want to know what plagued her at the end, and I still have my beliefs about what she went through, especially now that I'm standing in my mirror looking at my reflection, perfectly matching my entire image, all except for the corner of my reflection's mouth, lifting ever so slightly.